let us welcome Ruth, who is the better looking half of the very talented sober duo. Ruth has been a member of Muswell Hill Synagogue since 1966, when she married Anthony, as we would all have guessed. The second only marriage, or the second marriage from the beginning of Muswell Hill Shul in its present building. So claim to fame. She obtained a BSc in zoology and human physiology from Manchester University, so she's a good lady. And she subsequently worked in biochemical research at University College, taught at secondary and primary level, elected a scientific fellow of the Zoological Society of London in 1967. And in 1984, she became an educational volunteer at London Zoo, presumably not teaching monkeys to do tricks, but she'll no doubt tell us what she was doing. So, after 22 years of volunteering, I'm delighted to welcome Ruth, who will tell us all about, if it's Tuesday, it's Zoo Day, but actually it's Wednesday, so it's Toth Day. Ruth.
Thank you very much and welcome everybody. If it's Tuesday, it's Zoo Day, is because...
Ruth, can I ask you to get a bit closer to your microphone? Some of us are rather hard of hearing.
I will
No,
get Anthony.
you have to speak louder because the camera is on the microphone, so you just have to speak louder.
I'll shout.
I'll stand up and you can talk to me.
Okay, the reason my title is If It's Tuesday, It's Zoo Day was the day I mainly used to work at London Zoo. I did work on Thursdays, but that was when I was teaching a job share. So, the Zoological Society of London, ZSL, and London Zoo were the brainchild of Sir Stanford Raffles. Some of you may have had the good fortune to go to Singapore and stay in the Raffles Hotel. It's one of my bucket lists. And in the early 19th century, he created ZSL, and London Zoo was opened to the scientific public in 1828. It was intended as a collection of scientific interest and study. Over the years, many changes have taken place with animal husbandry and management changing as ideas about the welfare and breeding of the collection changed with increasing knowledge. Today, London Zoo is the oldest public zoo in the world, and together with its sister zoo, Whipsnade Zoo, which opened in 1931, is a formidable scientific organization involved not just in animal welfare, but in the breeding of endangered species throughout the world, in the hope that they can be returned to the wild. In 1967, I graduated in zoology and became proposed and seconded as a scientific fellow of the Zoological Society and started my close association with the zoo. At that time, and with subsequently 3 small children, my main aim was to make sure all 3 knew all their animals. And in fact, as time went by, they became so familiar with the place that they could almost have become tour guides. We also enjoyed lunches there on a Sunday in the Fellows Restaurant, which could only be used by fellows and their guests. In 1984, while browsing through one of the members' magazines, I discovered the zoo actually had educational volunteers, and so I naturally applied to join. I was interviewed, accepted, and because of my particular interest in aquatic animals, was told, right now you're the zoology aquarium specialist. Now, these trolleys were basically cupboards on wheels with the surface for displaying various objects on, and with a metal framework at the back on which we could handle different materials. They were the brainchild of the then head of education, a man called Michael Borer, and the idea was to have a trolley at various strategic places around the zoo, so that We have the aquarium trolley, we have the reptiles, birds, cats, insects, primates, and ungulates. Now you may be surprised to know you know what they are. They're animals that have cloven hooves and chew the cud. Having visited many zoos around the world and dragged Anthony with me, I think that his idea of displaying animals in this way for the benefit of the public was the very best. And sadly, it has become greatly reduced, and even the fixed exhibits, like the reptiles, seem infrequently manned, or should I say personed. Soon after I joined, I found my A-level teacher was also working there. She was in charge of the insect trolley. And it took me 18 months to call her Isabel instead of Mrs. Crookshank. It was because of her that I studied zoology for my degree, and I would often join her on her trolley to learn more about the insect world. She was absolutely inspirational. When I started on the aquarium trolley, it was an absolute mess. In fact, it had very little on it. And I had to beg, borrow, and get exhibits. I also asked anyone going abroad to bring things home before it was stopped by law, in case we brought stuff in that could be actually dangerous, carrying bacteria or small animals or whatever. I also myself browsed beaches wherever we went and ended up with a display second to none. In fact, it got so good I had too many things pinched off it. And it's because I couldn't keep an eye on everything. It was also my job to instruct all the other volunteers how to use my trolley, by the way. This was my trolley. I spent 22 very happy years there until they changed our remit to become what I called police volunteers, telling visitors not to take photos of the gorillas with a flash, not to bang on the glass, and various other sins. I was happy to tell a stupid woman standing next to me in front of the gorillas enclosure, by the way, we don't have cages anymore. We have enclosures which are usually very much larger and enable the animals to lead a relatively comfortable life. This woman started, you know the way they tried to copy gorillas going under the arms and the silverback gorilla, which is the large male, took offense and he flew into a rage and threw himself at her. The glass in that section vibrated frighteningly, but is specifically thick to prevent any damage to either party. And I think the other people standing around us got the message too. Over the years, not only did I learn a lot, but I also hope I gave our visitors an interesting experience, rather than just looking at animals in enclosures. Now, we often receive, the whole zoo that is, from material from all sorts of visitors, such as we got a crocodile head in the post once, and I put it out on display because crocodiles do live in water even though they're reptiles, and that disappeared. Now, I have here some absolutely wonderful shells that I also had on my trolley. This is a helmet shell. You might have seen one, it's a full-sized one, and it came from South Africa and was brought for me specifically to put on the trolley, but was my property. This is the largest of the cowries and is called a golden cowrie. And if you see on the other side, it's got what my children used to call the zip shells. It's zip. Now, if that were perfect, which it isn't, because if you can see it's got damage here and here, it would cost a lot of money. Now this, some of you might find disgusting, but is actually called an black dorid catfish and comes from the Amazon. It was brought by Amakotan for me. And whilst this is not actually endangered, we do have some live ones in the aquarium. And the amazing thing about this creature is, if you can see, if I can get this in, can I get this? I don't know if you can see, because off at the edge of the fins, it's almost like a cone. Can you hear it as I rub my nail through it? Now, what these creatures do is they rub their fins against these scales down the side and can actually communicate with the other catfish of this species. Now, I was supposed to have studied paleontology, but usually fell asleep in the lessons because the lecture was so damn boring. However, one day he dropped with a great thud a large stone about this big onto a desk. It was a sort of speckled stone and pronounced that it was a dinosaur turd, or coprolite in zoological terms. The London Zoo has put on a very interesting display. Some of you might have seen it a few years ago, and it was called Pooh in the Zoo. The exhibition was of all sorts of different coprolites from different animals. These are all fossils. And of course, it was some disgust to some visitors, and to others were fascinated. I was subsequently invited by the curator of bugs to set up a display of fossils. Now, as I've just said, I didn't know much about fossils, but together with my son's geological books and paleontology books, I was able to actually get together a very interesting collection of fossils. And you can see it out on display in Bugs building, where the various insects and invertebrates are. I have myself a couple of small fossils. This, some of you may be familiar with, this is called a Trilobite. If you can see, it's got 3 lobes, Trilobite. Okay, and this is mine. And the other one, I've got several others, but I'm only going to show you 2. This one is a sliced fossil. And this one is called, she says, looking at it, a nautiloid. Now, I also have a modern nautiloid shell. Again, some of you may be familiar with this. And this is actually a cross-section. So if you were able to cut this nautilus shell in half, it would look exactly the same in pattern as this one here. Now, this particular animal looks like this in real life. Have I got this the right way up? Yes. You can see it. This is the animal here. This are its tentacles here. And it's related to the octopus and squid. More about that later. Now, on one occasion, I was on the primates trolley. Primates are monkeys and apes. Now, there are 4 groups of apes amongst the 8 group species of apes. There are gorillas, which we have at London Zoo. We have chimpanzees at Whipsnade Zoo. Orangutans we used to have many, many years ago. And then the 4th group is the naked ape, us. We belong in the group of primates called apes. We also had on this trolley several skulls, some real, some reproductions, and the skin of a black fringed colobus monkey, which we hung over the framework at the back. But that sadly had died of measles many years ago, and it had been turned into fur. with the skin properly prepared. Now, the skull of a baby chimp and a baby human are very, very similar. They're quite flat, okay? But within 3 years, the skull of a baby chimp grows forward in the nasal area because that's where the smell senses are, and it's so important to chimpanzees to be able to smell. Whereas our babies, we grow up into adults with flat faces. We don't need our sense of smell so much. We rely on our eyes, on our taste, etc. Chimps, as I said, rely on their sense of smell. And I was explaining all of this to a very charming American gentleman who'd come up to have a look and see what I had. And I asked him where he was from and what did he do, because we always used to try and engage with the visitors. To my embarrassment, he replied that he was a professor of comparative anatomy. He was actually very complimentary and said that the presentation that we gave was something he'd never come across before except in university. And it was very, very good for the public to know about these sorts of things. Now, our big cat's trolley had both skulls and skins on it, the latter being thrown over the arch. The idea here was to exhibit how strong the cat's jaws were, looking at its teeth, particularly the large canine teeth, which they used for killing prey and for tearing the flesh apart, and also for suffocating, particularly the big cats, by gripping the throat and suffocating them. Now, the skins we had were leopard and ocelot, and were ready for use in the fur trade, and had been donated to us after they'd been confiscated by customs and excise. Now, the strangest situation here was we had gentlemen of a certain Middle Eastern origin asking how much were the skins, and we had to explain to them that we're very sorry, but they're not for sale. They're here as an example to try and discourage visitors from buying animals that were killed purely and simply for their skins, and many of which were endangered. That meant that on the scale of problems, they really were in difficulty. So now London Zoo, together with most other zoos around the world, belongs to an organisation called CITES that you may have heard of, and that stands for the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. This organisation tries to help endangered species anywhere in the world through education, breeding, and returning to the wild where possible. There's also the Red Book, which is the Bible of CITES, which records the genetic ancestry of each animal in captivity to enable satisfactory matings to ensure a successful gene pool. Now, sadly, there are all over the world, particularly in Africa and South America, centers that actually rescue animals like baby orangutans, ringtail monkeys, vervet monkeys, lion-headed tamarins, where the mother has been deliberately killed and the baby sold as a pet. The trusts that look after these baby creatures, that when they rescue them, rear them and teach them as many skills as the parents could teach them, and then release them into a safe environment. Now, we've had several success stories with the cooperation of other zoos and on endangered species that have been bred in, we have had several success stories where with the cooperation of other zoos, endangered species have been bred in captivity and returned to the wild. The Arabian Oryx. There are two types of oryx. There's the Arabian and the scimitar-horned oryx. And the Arabian oryx was in very great decline, particularly during the 50s and 60s. And zoos around the world and organizations where they had an oryx got together to create what's known as a world herd. That's a minimum of 9 animals that can breed and interbreed without causing any major problems. And these Arabian Oryx, when they created a big enough herd, were actually returned to the Bedouin Arabs. And in return for the Bedouin Arabs taking care of them, they were allowed to kill the males and use the meat and the fur from those animals. The species flourished as a result. Now, another one was, and I love this word, I think it's Polish, Przewalski horses. The spelling is Przewalski. I hope I pronounced that correctly. From Mongolia. This species flourished as a result when it was returned to the wild. Now, very sadly, even in the last week, I have collected, I'm not going to show you these, but to tell you about them, 3 newspaper cuttings that show how much damage we are doing to our world. There's an animal called the pangolin, and this is a mammal, but it also has scales, a little bit like the, oh gosh, I've had a magic, what do you call it moment? Hedgehogs. Hedgehogs have spines, pangolins have scales, and they're made of the same material as our nails. But for some reason, they're considered to have an aphrodisiac effect. And they kill these animals, and it's reaching the point of becoming endangered in the wild. Also, trophy hunting, I noticed that in this country is going to be banned, thankfully. So that if you go and shoot a giraffe or an elephant or whatever, you're not going to be allowed to bring back your trophies into this country. There's the loss of the Brazilian rainforest, which is often known as the lungs of the world. Human beings are damaging and destroying the rainforest and in ever encroaching onto it to get the wood and also to use the land for growing things on. Now, I don't know if any of you are familiar with horseshoe bats. They are the animals that belong along with crabs and lobsters. And these particular creatures have blood which, unlike ours, which is made with iron, i.e. hemoglobin, theirs is made with copper, known as hemocyanin. And somebody discovered some years ago that this particular blood can be used on sterilized surgical instruments to detect if there were any bacteria left on them, so that they would have to be re-sterilized. And as a result, instead of there being hundreds of thousands of these horseshoe crabs around the world, they are now being given, have their blood taken, and it's a sort of bluish green color, not red like ours. I gave a talk during one of my courses at U3A, the University of the Third Age, on what I just called the world's most destructive animal, Homo horribilis. That's what we are, unfortunately. We are horrible to the world. Certainly sapiens is not the appropriate name. Homo sapiens. Now, at Christmas time, the zoo put on nativity scenes, and we had 2 Father Christmases. We had to have 2 because we had so many schools coming through who wanted to see Father Christmas. And our role, if we were looking after the groups of children to go and see Father Christmas, was to talk to them about the various animals in the zoo relating to the nativity, etc. And then we would take the children into Father Christmas one at a time, and he would ask them, what would you like for Christmas? And the children's faces used to light up. And then, having heard what they wanted, he would then give them a toy from out of his sack. Now, there was one lass, about 9 years old, a little black child, who came in to see Father Christmas, and he talked to her, and then he handed her a present out of his sack. And she took one look at it and threw it at him, saying, I don't want that rubbish. So he tried to give her another one. And she wasn't having any of that either. So I slipped out and had a word with the school teacher, who came in and removed her. I don't know what happened to her. Otherwise, these activities went on very easily and successfully. There are children who are not allowed to see Father Christmas, usually the Jehovah's Witness children. But the teachers decided that even though they weren't allowed to see Father Christmas, they nonetheless got a little gift from the zoo, which was very nice. Now, I enjoyed the reptile trolley very much indeed. This is now a fixed exhibit in the reptile house as you walk in on the left-hand side. On there was a crocodile skin, a very small crocodile skin, only about 3 foot long, some lizard skins, all sorts of amazing colours dyed, all of which had been confiscated by customs and excise. And we also had a stone, a very heavy stone. And we would hand it to the visitors and ask them what they thought about it. It was actually a fossil vertebrate from an extinct dinosaur. Explaining to the visitors what fossilization was fascinating. I mean, the word fossil comes from the Latin fossilis, meaning to dig up. We don't know what the dinosaur was that this piece of vertebra had come from. But essentially, fossilization means turning something, say bone, into stone. And that's why this piece of vertebrae weighed such a lot. It had been fossilized and it was actually stone. It was no longer bone. I was often able to go behind the scenes in every part of the zoo. Volunteers were encouraged, in fact, to go. And the reptile house had a wonderful breeding program. Hundreds of thousands of small terrapins have been tried to be brought into this country illegally. Snakes as well. Any reptiles could be brought into the zoo, particularly from Heathrow, which has its own what it calls the Ark, where they keep all these confiscated animals. And I also had a very thankfully well-fed boa constrictor put round my shoulders. Now, a lot of people think snakes are slimy, and quite the contrary. They're very cool, very soft, and very silky to touch. And if you want to test something that you think might be real snake in your property, the way to tell it is to brush your hand gently down one way, down to the other. And if it's very soft both ways, it means that it's artificial. If, on the other hand, when you brush your hand down, one way it's smooth, and the other way it comes up peculiar, it's very rough. That is because the scales attached to the snake are fixed at the head end of the snake, of the scale, but not at the rear end of the scale. So it's separate from the skin, and that's why you can feel the difference. We have Komodo dragons at London Zoo. Komodo dragons are the largest of the lizard family. In fact, the largest of the monitor lizard family as well. They can grow to up to about 9 foot, 10 foot long, and they are vicious beasts. One of our animals is a male, and the other was a female, who, when she arrived, then laid eggs, which were taken by the keepers and incubated elsewhere. The reason being that as soon as these tiny creatures emerge from their eggs, they're eaten by the adults. In the wild, they scuttle straight off into the trees instinctively and stay up there till they're too big and quick to be able to escape from the adults. The Kimono Dragon has in its mouth 54 different toxic bacteria. And how it kills its prey, say a deer of some sort, it bites it on the ankle, and then it follows it and keeps following it until it dies, and then it eats it. Now, the ones that were reared in London Zoo, the ones that came out of the eggs that the female had laid, in fact, wouldn't have those bacteria. They do have bacteria in their saliva, but certainly nothing like the adults. Now, the bird trolley was a no-no for me. I hate dead birds. But the one in the elephant house was fascinating. We had the actual skull of an elephant, and it is huge. Well, you know how big an elephant is. An elephant has, during its lifetime, 6 sets of teeth. And we have a set of teeth there to demonstrate to the visitors. Once they lose their last set of teeth, they can no longer eat and eventually die. Now, incidentally, the elephant teeth look just like the mammoth teeth that are dug up in Siberia because they're the same animals. Now, the rhino horn, which we had on the trolley, was worth a fortune because in several Far Eastern countries, again, it's supposed to contain aphrodisiac qualities. Contrary to expectation, it's actually made up of fibres of keratin, like your nails are made of, closely bunched together within the horn itself. And needless to say, that disappeared as well. We never ever found it. We had no idea who took it. One of the things I used to enjoy enormously was the open evening, particularly in the aquarium. I would go with my friend Steve, who was one of the keepers, and we would go down to Sainsbury's in Camden Town and get in all the food and drink and lay it out appetizingly on plates for the visitors to come and eat. And my main job of the evening was actually, believe it or not, to sell raffle tickets, as well as talking about the history of the building and its inhabitants. Please don't take advantage of me. I seem to have a talent for selling raffle tickets, and I always made an absolute fortune for them. In 1992, there was an uproar amongst many of the staff and members of the society. There was a feeling that the Zoological Society wanted to sell London Zoo for building land. And this was strongly denied by them. But when we asked to see the books for Anthony to have a look, this was denied. Now, ordinarily, we always had figures that were shown at the AGM, but that particular year, they were not available. As a fellow, I joined a group of the keepers and other fellows and staff who have voting rights to try and find out what really was truly happening. Can you hear me, everybody?
No.
Well, if you could speak louder, it would help.
Right, I will try to get, you know, I used to speak much louder than this when I was teaching. I don't know why I've stopped doing it now. So we managed to get a quorum, which included my having to drive up to Highgate and pick up then a very elderly gentleman to take him back to the zoo to join that quorum. And we were able to organise an extraordinary general meeting that took place in Senate House near University College. In a packed hall to over 500 members of the society, where the press was excluded, we threw out the existing president, treasurer and secretary and voted in people who we knew we could trust. The zoo then went from strength to strength, and there was no further talk of selling the zoo off. We've got bigger and better enclosures for its animals, better husbandry, and more species, sadly, that can be seen. We take in species specifically that are possibly on the endangered list or even extinct in the wild. And I'll tell you a story about this. Those of you who go to Israel and eat Nile perch, what happened was Nile perch were introduced into Lake Victoria in Africa to improve the protein for the people who lived around the lake, their protein intake. What they hadn't taken into account was that Nile perch have to eat as well. And these fish eventually reduced so radically the numbers of some species of what we call kitchlids, which are mouth-brooding fish, that some of them are now totally extinct in that lake. We've got some in London Zoo, and together with other zoos, we are breeding them. But where to put them? We don't know. They have no idea where they're going to reintroduce them. It certainly can't be in Lake Victoria. As a result also of the zoo having the financial problems in the early 90s, we lost 5 out of our 8 volunteers, keepers in the aquarium. And the aquarium is a huge building. It's just under the old Mappin Terraces. And I always loved going in there. Now, I volunteered to help out, not on the day I came in as a volunteer, but to come in on a separate day. And I ended up brushing the floor with wet sand to make sure it was all clean, and also feeding the fish. That was my job. I fed fish with pellets, I fed them with flakes, and then we had the fussy eaters. Now, a salamander is an amphibian, and it breeds by producing eggs underwater, which turn into tadpoles, large tadpoles, but tadpoles. And these tadpoles are very interesting, because what has happened in nature is that they can actually breed in the tadpole state. And the tadpole state that breeds is known as a neotenic form, and it is the axolotl. It's an ugly looking beast in my opinion, but that's my opinion. Now, to feed an axolotl, I used to have to go into the kitchen and slice thin slices of ox tongue, and then dangle it in tweezers in front of the axolotl's mouth, and it would grab it. So that's how we fed the axolotl. The other inmate in the aquarium that was fussy was the pike. Now, pike will only eat live fish. And next to the pike tank was a small tank in which we had bred fish, freshwater fish. I can't remember what they were. And I used to have to go and take a net and fish one out and drop it into the pike tank. I always felt very bad about that and used to apologize to my poor victims. In 206, a huge consignment of illegal coral and tropical fish from Indonesia were intercepted by the police at Heathrow, and they were brought to London Zoo. Now, if I tell you that consignment of corals occupied an area from floor to ceiling as big as 2/3 of our Shaw Hall. Effectively, it was almost, and probably was, a coral reef that had been destroyed by explosives. And they tried to bring them stuff into England to sell. Now, the corals, each coral was wrapped individually in a piece of newspaper and tied with coloured string. They were very amorphous looking parcels, I must tell you, because there was all sorts of different types of corals. I unwrapped several of them and was shocked at the damage that had been done to the reef. This is one piece of branched coral. Can you see the tiny holes in it? Inside those tiny holes lived tiny little jelly-like creatures called polyps. This is a picture of what it would look like, about 2 to 3 millimeters in height. I've also got here this, which is called organ pipe coral. And again on the top, you can see the holes that were occupied by the original inhabitants. This is blue coral. And on it, in one part, again, if you can see the tiny holes, again, that were polyps. Now, these tiny polyps are a little bit like sea anemones. I don't even remember sea anemones when you were children. They're sort of like brownish red blobs, jelly-like. And when they're open, their tentacles are at the top, all round, floating in the water. If they're disturbed, they withdraw them like this. Now, the same happens with the polyps of the corals. And effectively what's happened is somebody or people who have damaged and destroyed thousands of tiny little animals that have spent years and years and years creating coral by producing calcium carbonate shell around them and building it together with others over, as I said, many, many years. Some coral reefs have been here for thousands, if not millions of years. One thing the zoo will not do, it will not use coral in its tanks in this form, because it doesn't want to encourage people to put coral into their fish tanks and go out and buy it and continue this terrible trade. But what it does do is it doesn't waste it. It turns it into fine coral sand, which is in the bottom of all its tanks. Now, I have here a picture. This is our daughter Libby with her daughter, our granddaughter Timna. But the important part of the picture is the jaw. This is a shark's jaw that used to be part of my display on my trolley. Now, it may come as a surprise to you to know that there are two kinds of fish in the ocean. There are bony fish, which are the main number of species, and there are cartilaginous ones. The sort of, the material made from our noses, rubbery, is a much, much lighter skeleton for the fish. That particular jaw was fascinating because sharks lose their teeth on a regular basis. They lose them when they're catching their prey. And you could see within the jaw structure itself, actually, about 7 or 8 different rows of new teeth ready to be shoved into the mouth or grow into the mouth to replace the lost teeth and broken teeth. The shark's jaw disappeared. Do you know, I think it's as bad as the police station where I work, where I keep losing my scissors and hole punches. Those of you who went to see the film, I think it's called Nemo? Nemo? Right. Nemo is actually a clownfish and one of several species. And it is peculiar in that it can actually swim amongst the tentacles of sea anemones. In good aquaria, this can be seen, such as London Zoo Aquarium. And other fish, if they tried to do that, would be caught and eaten. But the clownfish seem to produce some sort of slime on its body which contains a chemical that the anemone doesn't respond to. Now, I was very saddened to see in the Jerusalem Aquarium a couple of years ago, it was new, and they had this 10-foot circular tank with dozens of clownfish in there, but not a single sea anemone. And I actually spoke to the head of the aquarium and talked to him about it. And he said that they were actually going to put some in. So if any of you go there and see, I'd be interested to hear. Now, one of my two very exciting experiences in the aquarium, apart from running the trolley and everything else, was the day I saw seahorses being born. Seahorses, incidentally, are a fish, a bony fish, but they're peculiar because they have a head and a neck, unlike any other self-respecting fish. The female lays her eggs inside a sac in the male body. And that's in that sac that the eggs are fertilized. And I was standing outside the tank watching what was going on. At about umbilical level in the male sac, there's a tiny little aperture. And every so often, the abdomen would contract. And out through that little hole would come a spout of baby seahorses. They were about as big as a comma. And off they would float into the tank. The other experience I had, which was very peculiar, is cuttlefish, which belong to the mollusk group, snail group. We had some eggs presented to the zoo, and they had hatched. And I was sitting watching them because I was fascinated with the way they used their little tentacles. They would either throw them up in the air or to the side or whatever. And I was busy drawing them, and suddenly realized that there was a semicircle of baby cuttlefish watching me, watching them. Now, cuttlefish, octopus and squid belong to a group of mollusks called cephalopods. The largest eye in the world, believe it or not, doesn't belong to the elephant. It's got a small eye. Doesn't belong to the blue whale. That's got a relatively small eye too. It belongs actually to an animal called the colossal squid. We don't have one in the aquarium because it's too big. We have had squid in the aquarium before, little ones. But the colossal squid eye, believe it or not, is the size of a football. And the lens in its eye is as large as a tennis ball. And we believe that it has such a large eye to help it avoid sperm whales, which enjoy eating colossal squid. I also think that because they are deep sea dwellers where it's very, very dark, if they can see the animals that produce what's called bioluminescence, flashes of light, then they can find food as well. Now, my last story is one that didn't happen to me, but it's a bit of fun. Apparently in the 1930s, the night watchmen were going around the aquarium. And let me tell you, it's black in there, pitch black. You can't see a thing. I got caught there once when the lights were out. You cannot see a thing. You don't move until they put the safety lights on. And the night watchman came into the aquarium with his big torch, shot it around, and suddenly realized about 12 inches off the ground were two big bright eyes. And he fled screaming, and he brought two of his mates back. And they went and walked into the aquarium with their torches, and they moved very gingerly along the pathway until they reached this Houdini of the aquarium. It was an octopus. It had escaped from its tank. So that's it. Okay, if anyone would like to ask questions, I'll be try to answer them. Okay?
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Ruth, thank you very, very much indeed for a totally fascinating story. The idea of your granddaughter waving the jawbone of a shark does remind me, of course, of Samson, but she's much better looking. So, anybody who has a question, please wave or something, and I will try and unmute you. So, questions before I start. Questions, questions?
What?
You've covered absolutely everything. So in that case...
There's one thing I haven't covered.
Oh, well,
and I'm surprised
Leonard.
Costs.
Right, Leonard.
How much does it cost to get into the zoo today?
I don't know how much
to know.
Yes.
Hello.
How much does it cost?
How much?
Well, it actually costs about £23.50 for an adult. £17 for a child up to the age of 15 and nothing for a child up to the age of 3. People say to me, oh my God, that's so expensive.
Yes.
But then if you want to go to Madame Tussauds today, it's £31 an adult.
Very expensive.
If you want to go to the theatre, it's 50 odd pounds for a ticket. Or if you want to go to the Royal Opera House, it's actually over £100, £150 for the stalls. So in reality, a ticket to the zoo gives you entry from 10 o'clock in the morning until 5:30, and you spend the whole day there. In normal times, not at the moment. Things are very different at the moment. If you want to go to the zoo today, you have to ring up and make a date and an appointment, okay? Right, David, what would you like to ask me?
Well, Leonard has got a question. So,
Leonard's over here. I'm not going to ask you about any haggises that you might have being kept captured or kept in the zoo. But my question is regarding the weather and the temperature of this country. It's always puzzled me how these animals who have come from as far as the north and exceptionally cold to the Sahara Desert and all over the place, how they can actually be happy in the zoo. Now, I know you can keep the snakes warm in their tank, but there must be a feeling that when these animals are outside and our temperature, look at the weather, it can be so dull, it can be so cold, it can be strange. How they monitor to make sure that they're happy? Right,
well, for a start, no animal would succumb to the ice and freezing weather would ever be outside. They're always kept indoors, in their enclosures, in the right conditions. And believe it or not, the right conditions are so important to the zoo because if an animal is happy, it will breed. So you can rest assured that they take care of their animals very much. Now, desert animals, for example, like camels, they are used to very hot days and very cold nights.
In the desert.
So they would keep them indoors and they wouldn't let them out during the day. And they certainly make sure that their animal management is on top of them so that they know exactly how to keep them. That's why the animals survive so well, particularly in modern zoos. When they started zoos off before, you know, when kings and emperors used to have their own private zoos, the animals died very quickly because they didn't know how to look after them and they just kept replacing them with more and more. But zoos today take very good care of all their animals all the time and deal with all their practical needs.
Thank you, and it was a most interesting delivery. Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent.
Questions? Further questions? Further questions? We really have covered just about everything.